My mother-in-law spent 4 years quietly telling my husband that our daughter wasn't his. Never out loud, never anything you could hold. Just a look when Ava walked in the room. A comment about how she didn't have the family nose. A seed planted and watered for 4 years. Then, last spring, she took it further. She waited until she was babysitting, she used our daughter's toothbrush, and she mailed off a secret DNA test to prove I'd cheated. To prove Ava wasn't her son's child. To finally, after 4 years, be right. The results came back. And they did expose a secret, just not the one she was hunting for. The test she ran to destroy my marriage instead detonated something buried for 36 years. A secret about her own son that not one person in that family knew, including him, especially him. And by the time we all understood what that envelope really said, the woman who'd spent 4 years policing my family's blood had blown the ground out from under her own. This is where it starts. Let me start at the beginning, because to understand what that DNA test blew open, you have to understand the 4 years of quiet war that led to it. My name is Rachel. I'm 34. I work as a labor and delivery nurse, which is a detail that's going to matter later in ways I couldn't have imagined when this started. I've spent my whole career in the room where families begin. I've handed thousands of babies to thousands of exhausted, weeping, overjoyed parents. I thought I understood everything there was to understand about how families are made. I did not. Not until it happened inside my own. I married Ethan when I was 28. He's kind in a steady, unglamorous way. A high school history teacher. The kind of man who remembers his students' birthdays and coaches the debate team for no extra money because somebody has to. When I met him, I remember thinking, this is a safe person. This is a person who will never blindside me. I was right about Ethan. I was wrong about his mother, Sandra, my mother-in-law. I want to be fair to her, even now, even after everything. So I'll say this. She loved her son fiercely, in the way of a woman who'd raised him mostly alone after her husband died young. Ethan was her whole world. And from the first dinner I ever had at her table, I understood that no woman was ever going to be good enough to take a piece of that world from her. That's common. Lots of mothers-in-law start there. Most of them soften. Sandra never did. She just got more sophisticated. She never fought with me openly. That would have given me something to point at, and Sandra was far too smart for that. Instead, she ran a campaign of small, deniable things. A compliment with a hook in it. You're so brave to wear that. A concern dressed as care. You just seem so tired lately. Is everything okay at home? She was a master of the sentence that sounds like nothing and lands like a splinter. The kind you can't respond to without looking crazy, because on paper, she'd said something nice. I used to try to explain it to friends, and I could never make it sound like anything. That's the whole design of it. My mother-in-law asked if everything was okay at home is not a sentence that gets you any sympathy. It sounds like she cares. You had to be standing in the room, watching the little tilt of her head, the timing of it, dropped right after I'd mentioned Ethan and I were doing great, to feel the blade slide in. She could take a happy announcement and, in 9 words, turn it into a question mark that hung over my marriage for a week. And if I ever reacted, she got to be the wounded one. I was only asking, I worry about you two. She'd built a machine that could hurt me and make me look paranoid for feeling it, all in the same breath. For the first few years, it was just the ordinary friction of a possessive mother. I could handle that. I'd roll my eyes to Ethan in the car on the way home, and he'd squeeze my hand and say, "That's just Mom," and we'd let it go. Then Ava was born, and Sandra found a new weapon, one that would take her 4 years to fully load. Because Ava, from the day she was born, looked like me, not Ethan, me. My coloring, my chin, my mother's wide-set eyes. Babies change, and everyone knows babies change. But Ava came out looking like she'd been photocopied from my side of the family, and I watched something flicker across Sandra's face in the hospital room the first time she held her. I was exhausted and euphoric, and I told myself I'd imagined it. I hadn't imagined it. That flicker was the beginning of everything. And it started so small I almost can't point to the first one. At Ava's christening, someone said, "She's got her daddy's eyes." And Sandra laughed, just laughed, a light little laugh, and said, "Well, she's got somebody's eyes," and moved on. And everyone kept talking. And I stood there holding my baby, feeling like I'd been slapped by a ghost, unable to prove a slap had happened. That became the pattern. Over 4 years, Sandra built a case out of nothing but tone and timing. When Ava learned to walk. Funny, none of my kids walked that early. Must be from your side. When people commented on the resemblance to me, yes, isn't it remarkable? You'd hardly know Ethan was involved at all. Each one a joke, each one deniable, each one a tiny deposit into an account she was building, and I watched, over those years, as my husband started to make withdrawals from it. Because here's the thing about that kind of campaign. It isn't really aimed at you. It's aimed at the person you love, and it works on them slowly, underneath their own awareness. Ethan would never in a million years have consciously doubted me. He's not that man. But doubt doesn't need consent. It seeps, and after enough years of his mother's little jokes, I started to catch him looking at Ava with something I'd never seen before. Not coldness. Worse than coldness. A question. A flicker of the same flicker I'd seen on Sandra's face in the hospital. I confronted him once, about 2 years in. I said, "Your mother is trying to make you think Ava isn't yours." And he got defensive. Not at her. At me? He said I was being paranoid, that I was too sensitive about his mom, that she didn't mean anything by it. Which is exactly what a person says when a splinter has gone in so deep, they can't feel it as a splinter anymore. It's just part of them now, and I want to be honest about my own part, because it wasn't nothing. There had been, years before Ava, a coworker, a friendship that got a little warmer than it should have, a few months where I'd enjoyed someone's attention more than a married woman ought to. Nothing happened. I never crossed the line. I ended it. I told Ethan at the time, and we'd worked through it and moved past it. But Sandra had somehow caught wind of it back then and filed it away, and I think it was the tiny grain of truth she built her whole cathedral of suspicion on top of. That's how the best manipulations work. They're not pure invention. They find the one real thread and pull on it until it looks like a rope. That fight scared me, because I realized Sandra was winning. Not with evidence. There was no evidence. There could be no evidence, because I had never once been anything but faithful to Ethan. She was winning with pure erosion. And I understood. Standing in my kitchen watching my husband defend the woman who was poisoning us, that suspicion doesn't need to be true to do its work. It just needs to be repeated. A lie told gently enough, often enough, for long enough, starts to reshape the person hearing it, whether or not there's a single fact underneath it. I want to say something to anyone listening who's living inside a version of this. The most dangerous betrayals aren't always the loud ones. Sometimes the thing eating your marriage isn't an affair or a secret account. Sometimes it's a third person, standing just outside the frame, patiently teaching one of you to distrust the other. And it is so hard to fight, because there's nothing to grab. You can't divorce a tone. You can't submit a raised eyebrow as evidence. You just have to watch someone you love slowly catch a sickness and hope they fight it off before it becomes who they are. I didn't know Sandra had already decided to stop waiting for the sickness to work on its own. I didn't know she'd decided to go get proof. I found out by accident, which is how I find out everything in this story, apparently. It was a Saturday in April. Sandra had watched Ava the previous weekend while Ethan and I went to a wedding out of town, one of the rare times we'd let her babysit overnight. Because honestly, by then I didn't like leaving Ava alone with her, but Ethan had insisted and I'd wanted to keep the peace. When we picked Ava up, everything seemed normal. Ava was happy. Sandra was her usual self, all sugar with a blade in it. A week later, I was doing something completely mundane, reconciling our credit card statement, because one of us has to and it's always me, and there was a charge I didn't recognize. Not huge. A little under $130 to a company whose name I didn't know. I almost let it go. But I've learned, from this whole ordeal, that the charge you almost let go is usually the one that matters, so I looked it up. It was a DNA testing company, one of the popular ones. And the charge was dated the Monday after Sandra's babysitting weekend. I sat there at the kitchen table, and my stomach did something I can still feel if I think about it, because Sandra didn't have access to our credit card. Except, and this is the detail that made it click, she did. Years ago, when Ethan's dad's estate stuff was being handled and Sandra was struggling with online forms, Ethan had added her as an authorized user on one of our cards, just to help her out, and we'd never taken her off, because who thinks about these things? She had a card, with our name on it. And she'd used it to order a DNA kit the day after she'd had our daughter alone for a weekend. I knew instantly what it was. I didn't need to wonder. 4 years of "she's got somebody's eyes" told me exactly what Sandra had done. She'd waited until she had Ava alone. She'd taken a sample, a toothbrush, a hairbrush, a cheek swab, while Ava thought it was a game. I still don't know exactly how. And she'd mailed it off to prove, finally, with science, the thing she'd been insinuating for 4 years. That my daughter wasn't her son's. That I was a liar and a cheat. That she'd been right all along. I want to describe what I felt, because it wasn't simple. There was rage, obviously. A white, total rage that a woman would secretly test a 4-year-old, my 4-year-old, like she was evidence in a trial. But underneath the rage was something colder and more frightening. Because I knew Ava was Ethan's. I knew it the way you know your own name. But Sandra had just introduced a document into our lives. An official, scientific, black and white document. And I understood that a document like that, once it exists, cannot be unexisted. Whatever it said, it was going to land in the middle of my marriage like a bomb. And I didn't even have it yet. Sandra did. Or she would. Any day. I had a choice to make. Fast. Do I tell Ethan now, get ahead of it, warn him what his mother had done? Or do I wait, and watch, and see what she did with the result? I made a decision I'm still not sure was right. I decided to wait. Because I wanted to see what kind of person Sandra really was when the result came back. And because some part of me, the part that had endured 4 years of splinters, wanted her to be caught holding the thing she'd built, in the open, where Ethan could finally see it. I didn't have to wait long. 10 days later, Sandra invited us to dinner. I knew. The second the invitation came, formal, a little stiff. Come for dinner Sunday, there's something the family should discuss. I knew the results were back. You don't say something the family should discuss about a pot roast. I spent that whole week in a strange, humming dread, watching Ethan be normal, kiss Ava goodnight, grade his papers, with no idea that his mother was about to try to blow up his life at her own dinner table, and that I was letting it happen because I needed him to see it with his own eyes. I did one thing to prepare. This is the part where being a labor and delivery nurse mattered, though not yet in the way it would later. I understood DNA tests. I understood what they could and couldn't say. And I understood something most people don't think about. The consumer kits, the ancestry ones, don't just tell you about the 2 samples you send. They compare your DNA against a whole database, and they tell you about relatives. Matches. The whole selling point is, discover relatives you never knew you had. I filed that away, without fully knowing why it mattered. It was just a professional reflex. Know the tool. We went to dinner. Sandra had made a real production of it. The good tablecloth, the cloth napkins. Ava set up at the little table in the next room, with a plate of chicken nuggets and a tablet, safely out of earshot. That detail chilled me. Sandra had planned this down to making sure my daughter was occupied for the demolition. We got through the meal. Small talk, brittle and strange. And then, as I was clearing plates, Sandra folded her hands and said, "Ethan, I need to show you something. And Rachel, I think you should sit down." And she slid an envelope across the table. I watched Ethan open it. I watched him read it. I watched his face, because after 4 years of his mother's poison, his face was the only thing I cared about in that room. And I watched him go completely, totally still. Then he looked up at his mother, and he said, in a voice I'd never heard him use with her, "What did you do?" Because here's what the envelope said. Sandra had sent in Ava's sample and her own, a grandmother-to-grandchild comparison, which is a thing these tests can estimate. And she had been so certain of what it would prove that she'd walked us into this dinner like a prosecutor with a closing argument. The report said Ava was the biological child of Sandra's son. To the degree these tests can show it through the grandmother line, the paternal side was confirmed. There was no affair, there was no other man. Ava was Ethan's daughter, exactly as I had said for 4 years, and the document Sandra had built to destroy me instead proved, in black and white, that I had been telling the truth the entire time. For 1 second, 1 single second, I felt vindicated. 4 years of splinters, and here was the proof, and Ethan was staring at his mother with dawning horror at what she'd tried to do. And then I saw Ethan's eyes drop back to the page, to a second section, and his face changed again, from anger into confusion, into something I couldn't read at all. Because the report didn't stop at Ava. Here's what Sandra didn't understand about the test she'd weaponized. To confirm that Ava was her granddaughter, the test compared Sandra's DNA and Ava's DNA and estimated their relationship. A grandmother and a biological grandchild share, on average, about 25% of their DNA. It's a range, not a fixed number, but there's a window, and a real grandmother-grandchild pair lands in it. That's the whole basis of how the test could confirm the paternal side at all. Except Sandra and Ava didn't land in that window. They shared almost nothing. A tiny percentage, the kind of number you'd see between two people who happen to have some distant, ancient overlap, the kind of match the test barely flags at all. Statistically, biologically, the report was saying that Sandra and Ava were not grandmother and granddaughter. Now sit with the logic of that for a second, because it took all three of us at that table different amounts of time to arrive at the same horrible place. Ava was confirmed to be Ethan's daughter. That part was solid. The paternal DNA was there. So if Ava was Ethan's child, and Ava was not Sandra's granddaughter, then there was only one thing that could possibly be true. Ethan was not Sandra's biological son. I got there first, I think, because I understood the science fastest. It's my job. I've sat with families and explained relationship percentages. I knew instantly that the number on that page was not a rounding error or a bad sample. 25% versus almost zero isn't a maybe, it's a wall. I watched Ethan get there second, watched him do the math on his own face, watched the color leave it. And I watched Sandra get there last, and I will never forget the sound she made. Not a word, just a small, broken intake of breath. The sound of a woman whose whole life just shifted under her feet. Because think about what she'd done. She had ordered this test in total certainty. She was so sure that Ava was another man's child, so sure I was a liar, that she'd been willing to detonate her son's marriage to prove it. And in her certainty, she had accidentally aimed the most powerful truth-telling tool in the world at the one question no one in that family had ever thought to ask. She'd gone hunting for my secret. She'd found her own. The son she'd raised for 36 years. The son she'd defended and adored and built her entire life around. The son whose wife she'd spent 4 years trying to destroy in his name. That son did not share her blood. The room was completely silent except for the sound of Ava's tablet in the next room, some cheerful cartoon jingle, my daughter laughing at something, blissfully unaware that at the grown-ups table, the ground had just opened up. I remember staring at the tablecloth, the good one, the one Sandra had brought out for what she thought would be her moment of triumph, and thinking how completely, catastrophically the evening had turned. She'd set this table to expose me. She'd polished the silverware to watch my marriage end. And instead, she was sitting there having just learned, at her own carefully staged dinner, that the son she'd built the whole ambush to defend was not, biologically, hers at all. Ethan set the paper down very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid to break, and he said, so quietly I barely heard it, "Mom, what is this?" And Sandra, who always had a sentence ready, Sandra who could turn any moment to her advantage, Sandra had nothing. She just stared at the paper, and in that silence, I realized something that turned my blood cold. She wasn't only shocked. Some part of her was afraid. I need to tell you what happened over the next few weeks, because the story doesn't end with the shock at the dinner table. That was just the fault line opening. The earthquake came after. Ethan, to his enormous credit, did not fall apart, at least not where anyone could see. He is a history teacher. He responds to a crisis by wanting to understand it. So the first thing he did, once we were home and Ava was asleep and the two of us were sitting up at midnight with the report between us, was start asking the only question that mattered. How? How could he not be Sandra's biological son? He'd seen his own baby pictures. He'd heard the story of his birth 100 times. There was no adoption. Sandra had been pregnant, had gone to the hospital, had come home with a baby. That baby was Ethan, wasn't it? That's when I, the labor and delivery nurse, had to explain to my husband the thing I'd spent my whole career quietly knowing was possible, but almost never see. Babies get switched. Rarely. Very rarely. Especially now. But Ethan was born in 1988, in a busy hospital, in an era before the security bans and the barcode scanning, and the two-nurse verification we use today. In 1988, in a crowded maternity ward, newborns were carried to a central nursery, and they came back to their mothers based on a bassinet card and a nurse's memory. And sometimes, rarely, catastrophically, they came back to the wrong mother. I watched Ethan absorb that. I watched him understand that the story of his own birth, the foundation under his whole identity, might have a crack in it that had been there since the day he was born, invisible for 36 years, waiting. We didn't sleep that night, or really the next several, because once that possibility was in the room, it explained things. It explained, in a way that made my heart break, the flicker I'd always half noticed between Sandra and Ethan, a distance she overcompensated for with fierce, almost anxious devotion. It explained the way Ethan had never quite looked like Sandra's side, a thing the family had always joked about the same way Sandra joked about Ava. He must take after his father's people. Everyone had a comfortable explanation. Nobody had ever tested it, because why would you? You don't DNA test the fundamental facts of your own life, until a vindictive grandmother accidentally does it for you. The cruelest irony, and I said this to Ethan that first night, was this. Sandra had spent 4 years obsessed with the idea that Ava didn't belong to our family by blood. And all along, the person who didn't share the family's blood, the person who'd been raised inside a biological lie, was her own beloved son. She'd been so busy policing the border of the family, so certain the threat was coming from outside, from me, that she never once imagined the discrepancy was already inside, sitting at her own table every Sunday, calling her mom. Ethan decided he needed to know for sure. Not the estimate from a consumer kit, the real thing. And that meant going back to the beginning, back to Sandra, and back to a hospital's 36-year-old records. But first, he had a question for his mother that couldn't wait. Because at that dinner, in that silence, he'd seen the same thing I had. He'd seen that his mother was afraid, which meant, maybe, that some part of her already knew. We went back to Sandra's 3 days later. Just Ethan and me. Ava stayed with my sister. Ethan sat his mother down and he asked her, directly, the question that had been burning in both of us. Did you know? And here is where the story became something I never saw coming. Because Sandra, who had lied by implication for 4 years, who had run a secret test to destroy me, did not lie now. Maybe she was too broken to. She looked at her son, and she started to cry, and she told us a story she had never told a living soul. She said that when Ethan was a baby, a few weeks old, she had known, not with a test, with a mother's body. She said that in those first weeks, she'd had a feeling she couldn't name, a wrongness, a sense that the baby she'd brought home didn't feel like the one she'd carried. She said she'd even gone back to the hospital once, with the vague complaint of a new mother, and a doctor had told her she was exhausted and hormonal, and that all new mothers feel strange, and had sent her home. And she had let herself be sent home. Because the alternative was unthinkable, and because by then she already loved the baby in her arms so much that the thought of him not being hers was worse than any peace of mind the truth could offer. So she had made a choice. 36 years ago, in the fog of new motherhood, she had decided not to ask the question. She had buried the feeling so deep that she'd almost convinced herself it never existed, and she had raised Ethan as her son, fiercely, completely, but with a splinter of doubt lodged in the very bottom of her heart that she never named, not to her husband, not to Ethan, not to herself. And that, I understood as she spoke, was the engine under everything. That was why Sandra had spent 4 years obsessed with whether Ava truly belonged to the family by blood. It wasn't really about Ava, or about me. It was about the question she'd refused to ask about her own son. She had a buried terror about blood and belonging, a wound she'd never let herself look at, and she'd spent 4 years pressing that same wound into my marriage, hunting in my family for the doubt she couldn't face in her own. People do that. They take the thing they can't bear to see in themselves and they go looking for it in you. Sandra had been trying to prove I'd brought a stranger into the family. Because 36 years ago, in a hospital in 1988, someone had, and the someone was her, and she'd never been able to admit it. I sat there listening to a 36-year-old confession, and I felt two completely opposite things at once. Fury, still, that she had done this to my child and my marriage, and a terrible, unwanted pity, because I was watching a woman finally set down a weight she'd carried alone since she was a young mother my age. As a labor and delivery nurse, I've seen that specific new mother fear. The ones who whisper, "Are you sure this is mine?" Half joking, hormonal, exhausted. We reassure them, and almost always we're right. But I sat at that table and understood that once, in this woman's life, the fear had been real, and a tired doctor had waved it away, and she'd spent the rest of her life not knowing what to do with having been right. Ethan listened to all of it. And when she finished, he did something that told me exactly who I'd married. He didn't scream, he said, "So you always felt it, and instead of finding out, you spent my whole life making sure no one ever asked. And then you did the exact same thing to my daughter." He stood up. "I need to go." The confirmation test came back 4 weeks later. It was true. Ethan was not Sandra's biological child. Somewhere out there, born the same day in the same hospital, was the son Sandra had actually carried, raised by strangers, 36 years gone. I want to talk about grief, because that's what the next few months were, and it wasn't the grief I expected. I thought Ethan would grieve Sandra, and he did, a little. But the bigger grief, the one that took him under for a while, was stranger and harder to name. He was grieving himself. Because when you learn at 36 that the story of your own birth is false, you don't just lose a fact, you lose a floor. Every you have your grandfather's hands. The men in our family always. Every inherited story that had told Ethan who he was. All of it turned out to be about a bloodline that wasn't his. He described it to me one night as feeling like a guest in his own life. Like he'd been reading a book about himself and someone had just told him it was fiction. And there was another grief underneath even that one. And it was the one that surprised me most, because it was mine. I grieved for the version of our family I'd been fighting to protect. I'd spent 4 years defending my marriage against Sandra's poison, and I'd won. The test proved I'd been faithful, proved Ava was Ethan's, proved everything I'd said. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt hollow, because I understood that being right had never been the point. The point had been a family, and the poison had done its damage whether or not I was vindicated. You can win the argument and still lose years you don't get back. I kept waiting for the sweetness of vindication to arrive. 4 years I'd imagined it, the day the truth came out, the day Ethan finally saw his mother clearly, the day I got to stop being suspected in my own home. And now it had all come, more completely than I'd ever dared hope, and it tasted like nothing. Because vindication is a story we tell ourselves about the future to survive the present, and when the future finally comes, the years it cost are already spent. I had my proof. I just also had a husband in pieces, a daughter who'd been swabbed like evidence, and a marriage I now had to rebuild from studs. Being right, it turns out, is a very small room to live in. If you've made it this far with me, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and join us every day, because I think stories like this one matter for a reason that goes way past the shocking twist. What happened in my family is an extreme version of something that happens in a lot of families, quietly, all the time. Someone carries a buried fear they refuse to look at, and rather than face it, they aim it at someone else. Usually the newest, most vulnerable member of the family, the in-law, the outsider, the easy target. If any of that is landing for you, if you've ever been the person a family decided to distrust so they wouldn't have to look at themselves, then you already understand the deepest part of my story, and I made this for you. So we sat with all of it. Ethan's grief, my hollow victory, and a question we now had to answer together. Because somewhere out there was a man, 36 years old, living a life, who was Sandra's actual biological son. And somewhere out there, maybe, was the family that had raised Ethan's biology, the people who were, in the blood sense, his. The test had a relatives feature. We could look, or we could close the laptop and never look, and try to rebuild on what we already had. That became the real decision, not the confrontation. The choice of what to do with a truth once you can't unknow it. We talked about it for weeks, whether to search. Ethan went back and forth. Some nights he desperately wanted to find his biological family, to see faces that looked like his, to answer the new questions that now lived in him. Other nights he'd say he already had a family, that he didn't need to go chasing strangers, that the people who raise you are the ones who count. Both things were true. That's the thing nobody tells you about these situations. There's no clean answer, because both answers are real at the same time. What finally moved us wasn't about Ethan at all. It was about the other man, the one Sandra actually gave birth to. Because the more we sat with it, the more we couldn't ignore a simple fact. Somewhere out there was a 36-year-old man who had a mother desperate to have known him, and who might have grown up wondering why he never quite fit his own family either. If we stayed silent, we weren't just protecting our peace. We were keeping the same kind of secret Sandra had kept, choosing comfort over someone else's right to the truth. And having just lived through what that choice does, neither of us could stomach becoming the next link in that chain. That was the moment the whole thing turned, for me, from a story about betrayal into a story about what you do with a truth once you're holding it. Sandra had held a truth for 36 years and buried it, and the burying had rotted everything it touched. Her marriage to a husband she never told, and eventually us. We had a choice, right there at our kitchen table, to become exactly what she'd been. People who decide the truth is too heavy and hide it in a drawer. And I realized that if we did that, then Sandra's real legacy wouldn't be the cruelty. It would be teaching us to do the same thing she did. I was not going to let her win that way, so Ethan reached out. Carefully, through the testing service, the way you're supposed to. It took months. I won't tell that whole story here, because it's his to tell, not mine, and because it's still unfolding. But I'll tell you the shape of it. There was a family 3 hours away. There was a man who had, in fact, always felt a little outside his own household, who had done a DNA test himself the year before, out of idle curiosity, and gotten a result that confused him and that he'd never fully chased down. When Ethan's message arrived, it landed like the missing half of a sentence he'd been living inside his whole life. And Sandra. This is the part that still undoes me. Sandra got to meet her biological son, the son she'd carried and lost, and mourned in secret for 36 years without ever letting herself say why. I was there for none of it. That was between them. But Ethan told me that the first time Sandra saw that man's face, a face that finally carried her features the way Ethan's never had, she wept in a way he'd never seen her weep. 36 years of a buried, nameless grief finally finding its shape. And I felt, God help me, compassion for her. Because underneath all the cruelty, underneath the 4 years of splinters, was a woman who had made one terrified choice as a young mother, and then spent her whole life paying for it in a currency she couldn't even name. That compassion didn't erase what she did to me. I want to be clear about that. It just sat next to it. Two true things, side by side. So where did we all land? Because that's the part people always want to know, and it's the part that's messiest, because real life doesn't resolve like a movie. Ethan and I are still married. Stronger, actually, though it took work and it took time. Surviving this together, the dinner, the grief, the search, burned away a lot of what had been quietly wrong between us. Because the truth is, Sandra's 4-year campaign had done real damage to us, the kind we'd never fully faced. We had to go back and deal with it. Ethan had to own that he'd let his mother's poison seep into how he looked at me and our daughter, that he'd defended her when he should have defended us. He did own it, fully. And I had to own that I'd let it fester for years, keeping the peace instead of forcing the fight. We did that work in a therapist's office, most of it, and I'd recommend it to anyone. There's no shame in needing help to rebuild something that got broken by someone else's hands. Ethan has a relationship now with his biological family. It's careful and new and good. He describes it not as replacing the family that raised him, but as finally having the whole picture. He met the man who is, biologically, Sandra's son, his swap, as they've started to darkly joke about it, and the two of them have an odd, real bond. Two men who were handed each other's lives at birth, and are only now comparing notes. It's one of the strangest and most beautiful things I've ever watched. They look at each other, Ethan told me, like each is looking at the life he almost had. The other man grew up on a farm 3 hours away, in a big, loud family. Ethan grew up an only child with an anxious, hovering single mother. Neither of them is angry about the swap anymore, which took time. Mostly they're just endlessly curious about each other, the way you would be about the person who got the life that had your name on it at birth. And Sandra. Ethan and I had to decide what she would be to us now. And what we decided was, present, but on new terms. She is still Ethan's mother in every way that 36 years of raising him made true, That doesn't vanish because of a lab result, and Ethan was clear that he wasn't going to throw away the woman who'd actually raised him. But the woman who ran a secret test on a 4-year-old, who spent 4 years trying to convince her son his wife was a liar, that woman had to face what she'd done. There was a long, hard conversation. There was a real apology, the first genuine one I'd ever heard from her, to me directly, with no blade in it. And there are boundaries now that didn't exist before. She is never alone with Ava without me or Ethan present, not as ongoing punishment, as a simple, permanent consequence. Trust, once you secretly swab someone's child, is not a thing you get to have back just by being sorry. Ava, thank God, remembers none of it. She was 4. To her, that dinner was just a night she got chicken nuggets and a tablet in the other room while the grown-ups talked. Someday, when she's much older, we'll tell her a version of this, the true version, carefully, at the right age. Because the one thing this whole ordeal taught me, above everything else, is what happens to a family that decides the truth is too dangerous to speak. We are not going to be that family. Not anymore. There's one last thing I need to tell you, and it's the thing I actually want you to carry out of here. I want to go back to the flicker, the one I saw on Sandra's face in the hospital, the day Ava was born, when she held my daughter for the first time and something crossed her expression that I told myself I'd imagined. I didn't imagine it, but I had it completely backwards for 4 years. I thought that flicker was Sandra seeing that Ava looked like me and deciding, in that moment, to doubt her. And maybe it was, a little, but I understand now that it was really something else. It was a woman who had spent 36 years refusing to look at a question about blood and belonging, holding a brand new baby, and feeling that old buried terror rise up in her again. Ava didn't threaten Sandra because Ava looked like the wrong family. Ava threatened Sandra because babies, and blood, and the question of who truly belongs to whom, were the exact wound Sandra had spent her whole life not touching. My daughter's face reopened a 36-year-old cut, and Sandra, not knowing what else to do with the pain, went looking for someone to blame for it. She chose me. Here's what I know now. The people who work hardest to expose a secret in someone else are very often standing on top of one of their own. Sandra needed me to be the liar so badly because she could not survive being the one with the buried truth, and the terrible mercy of that DNA test was that it took the choice away from her. It dragged the thing she'd hidden for 36 years into the light, whether she was ready or not. It nearly destroyed us, and it also, strangely, set all of us free. Ethan, who finally knows his whole story, the brother he never knew he had, and even Sandra, who got to hold her real son and finally grieve the thing she'd never been allowed to name. Blood is not what makes a family. I know that now in my bones. Ethan is not Sandra's blood, and she is still, unmistakably, his mother. Ava is Ethan's blood, and that was never what made him her father. The 10,000 ordinary days did that. And I am no one's blood in that family at all. And I am as much a part of it as anyone, because I'm the one who stayed and fought and told the truth when telling the truth was the hardest thing to do. Family isn't what you're born into. It's what you choose to protect, and how honestly you're willing to do it. If this story meant something to you, share it with 5 people who might need to hear it. And leave me a comment. Tell me honestly, if you were Ethan, would you have gone looking for your biological family, or would you have left it alone? I read every one, and tell me what you want us to talk about next. We're here every day, telling the true ones.